Welcome to the show. Charles Moscowitz here, and I'm joined by Mike Williams from Sage of Quay. He is emanating from Great Britain. He's a musician. He's got some incredible recordings that are available at Spotify and elsewhere. He has spent decades studying the Beatles specifically, the counterculture generally. Mike, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Charles, for having me on your podcast. I'm from Raleigh, North Carolina, by the way.
Okay. Well, I could tell from a little bit from the accent. The thing that brings me here is that, well, first of all, I've always loved and admired the Beatles, as have most of us who grew up with them, and I've always found their personalities to be very interesting. But there's something about them that I've always found that there was not an honest presentation. It was always very packaged, very calculated. And back in around 2001, 2000, maybe 1999, when I started to blog, I wrote a blog that I didn't think much would get much attention, in which I questioned the influence that the Beatles might have had on our society that was not necessarily good. And the two things I brought up was this frenzy that accompanied their, the what they call the British invasion, and women fainting and screaming, and men too, and just, this kind of almost like mind-altering reaction to them that seemed like people had become somehow transformed from what they previously were. And I was only a little kid at the time, but I do remember it. I remember going to like summer camp, and the girls were screaming the whole way there with Beatles songs, like on the top of their lungs. And then the second issue was a little bit more sinister, in that I believe that the Beatles, in a certain way, glamorized and legitimized drug use. Now, they're certainly not the first musicians or the first of any of us who have taken drugs recreationally, but they were the first, I think, to do it openly and to do it explicitly, and to write lyrics and songs about it, and to almost like create a culture around it that made it look really fun and really glamorous and really something that you'd want to embrace. And of course, by the 1970s, I knew several people close to me who died from overdosing on drugs. And I said, is this really something that is part of a greater agenda? Well, I wrote this blog, and years later, when I ran for Congress in Massachusetts, where I live, some reporter got a hold of it, and he went apeshit. He just, oh my God, how could he criticize the Beatles? Oh, and they did several stories on this. I mean, I'm like, what does this have to do with my campaign? But apparently it was something that they felt would disqualify me from holding public office. So you're coming along and talking about them and really taking a very good deep dive into perhaps what might have been going on there. Really caught my attention. So, Mike, why don't we start with generally what is your thesis regarding the Beatles?
The Beatles were a social engineering initiative created by Tavistock to social engineer the world and to move us into what Aleister Crowley refers to as the Eon of Horus. Many people will know it as the Age of Aquarius. I call the Beatles the Pied Pipers of the Eon of Horus, Charles. And that's because that's the role that they had. Their role was to break down traditional values, institutionalized religion, going back to, let's say, the 1950s. I put 1960 as a stake in the ground, although I know social engineering has been taking place before 1960. Mm-hmm. In 1962, the Illuminati, the controllers, however you want to label them, they put a big bullseye on Christianity, because that's got to go away in order for them to move to their new eon, or the new age, which is going to be pagan based. And like you and many, many, many people, I loved the Beatles. I grew up with the Beatles. It's the reason why I started playing guitar and writing songs and recording and all that stuff. Back in 2016, I read a book titled The Memoirs of Billy Shears. The book actually came out in 2009. So I was 7 years a little late. Okay. But I read the book in 2016. And when I read it, I just could not believe what I was reading. The book is classified as historical fiction, but there was so much detail in the book that I thought to myself, the only way this much detail can end up in this book is either A, the person who's playing the part of Paul McCartney is involved in the book, or it's somebody who is very, very close to the inner circle of the Beatles and that operation, which I refer to as Beatlemania. So what I wound up doing was I read the book, and then I went off taking a look at the claims that the book was making. And I was looking to see if I can prove or disprove them. And what happened was I found that much of the book was truthful. There are some fictional threads in the book. That's done intentionally in order to have plausible deniability. And also, that's because the protagonist, Billy Shears, and the author, encoder, Tom Harriet, they have signed secrecy agreements, so NDAs. So in order to not breach that contract, there has to be that thread of fiction running through the book. But the way the book is structured, it's layered. So I've counted 4 layers, 5 if you consider that the book is actually asking you to go outside the book to do additional research. But the book itself has 4 layers. So, when you read the first layer of the book, it's just like reading any other book. You just read it. But then there's encoding. That's why Tom Harriet is called the encoder versus an author. It's because he encoded the book in order to take the intrepid reader deeper into what was going on with the Beatles. You're getting more truth. Right. That's why I tell my audience the book is truthful. So when people want to argue, well, there's bits of fiction in it. Yes, I've always said there's bits of fiction in it.
Sure, it's like a decoy.
Right. But you also have to understand that the book is like a giant puzzle, and it's inviting you to come in and take a closer look and to dissect and decode all of the layers of the book. And once you do that, that book is really no longer fiction. It is now entered into the arena of nonfiction. So that's what happened, and that's how I got into it. I've been at it now for 7 years or so.
Right.
And it's been quite a ride.
Indeed. And before we go into Billy Shears and Paul McCartney, I want to do a little bit more background of the Tavistock Institute and what that was all about. I think it's safe to say that after World War II, the Tavistock Institute, which is still there in England, it's a massive psychological organization that analyzes behavior and manipulation of society, manipulation of emotion, in the same way that in the United States, the CIA had the MK Ultra program and the Soviet Union had their Polytech program. Probably other countries were doing this kind of experimentation as well. They learned a lot from the Nazi experiment in that the Nazis were brilliant at manipulating mass emotion. They would have these events, which I think the Beatles modeled a little bit, where they would have these rallies at night and they would cut down on sensory experience. They would be in the night, they would be dark, they would lose a lot of smoke, which created a smell. They would have massive speakers blaring Wagner into the crowd. They would, they would work everybody up into this hypnotic state, very carefully studied psychologically. And then Hitler would do this thing, which I think has been studied by demagogues ever since, where he would enter the room and he would start off very quietly and slowly, almost like he was going to faint. And then he would gradually increase and modulate his voice, and he would build up until by the end of the thing, he'd be screaming and flagging his arms in the air, and the entire audience would be in a state of complete transformation, complete frenzy. Women were having orgasms. I mean, they were fainting. I mean, it was, this massive experience that had a lot to do with the deprivation of sensory. People forgot who they were, and they became wrapped up in it. And I think that had a lot to do with the success of this movement at that time. I think that in the aftermath of the war, those lessons were learned by our elite Anglo-American establishment, whatever you want to call it, Illuminati, all of it. I mean, it goes back to the Illuminati of 1776, but it's all this idea of creating a new kind of human being that is stripped of the belief in a creator and that worships the state, and that basically the way to get to that is to remove the not only the basic morals and ethics of a person, but to actually make them forget who they are. I mean, it's, you transform them. Aleister Crowley, you mentioned, major figure in this movement, very much part of this whole network of secret societies that underlie all of it. And we should note that after World War II, the secret societies became legal in the United States in the form of the CIA and the national security agencies that, according to Professor Glennon of Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, he calls it the double government. And I think he's absolutely right. The Beatles, I mean, it's perfectly reasonable to assume that they would try an experiment like the Beatles, and that they would use the Beatles as a vehicle to create a mass consciousness that would fit their agenda. As you say, stripped of faith, stripped of a belief in a higher authority, all about what feels good. It's all about, I love you and you love me and we'll do this. And, it's all about sensory satisfaction in the present. There's no past, there's no future. And so it makes perfect sense to me that the Beatles would have been recruited by this agency, as you say.
I have put forth a hypothesis. I won't call it a theory because I really can't prove it, but there is evidence out there, Charles, that I believe the Beatles individually were in all likelihood in some kind of mind control program going back to very early ages. When you take a look at images on the internet of the Beatles, occulted images, one of the images that sticks out in my mind is the one where we have Paul McCartney and George Harrison with bird cages on their heads. Now, bird cages are Illuminati symbolism for mind control. And we also have a similar image with John Lennon wearing a Superman shirt with his head near a bird cage. So the Superman shirt is representative of the Übermensch, the superhuman.
Could I just interject here? Because I think that the imagery of birds is a thread that runs through the Beatles. I mean, all the way from "This Bird Has Flown," which is one of their songs on the on Rubber Soul, I think either that or Revolver. And I think that Day Tripper had reference to birds. There's
Free as a bird.
Free as a bird. There's Blackbird has bird sounds in it.
And your bird can sing.
And your bird can sing. Well, that's the one I was thinking of.
Yeah.
And John Lennon, I think, was asked about this once by a reporter, and he said that the bird is an image, a slang word for women in Britain. And that bird, we're going to get a bird, whatever. But to go back to your claim, you're saying that they possibly had been groomed at very young ages in this business of eventually finding themselves in this band, and then developing musical chops. I mean, these guys certainly had talent, and touring around Britain, really a lot of touring, so that they could develop a cohesive sound, which I think they did.
They had performance skills.
Yes. And now, at some point, or at what point, maybe I should ask, do you think, if at all, they became conscious of this fact? Did they know about the Tavistock Institute? Did they know that this was part of what they were about?
No, I don't think they knew.
Okay.
We have to remember when the Beatles got to Hamburg, Germany in August of 1960, John was 20, I think Paul was 18, and George was 17 years old.
Right.
And Alan Williams, their first manager, brought them to Hamburg. They're young guys. So I believe Alan Williams was their first prominent handler to get them started in Hamburg. And Hamburg was really boot camp in order for them to build their performance skills. When the Beatles got to Hamburg, they were marginal musicians at best, and they didn't show any signs of any songwriting aptitude. But Tavistock didn't care about the songwriting piece of it because Tavistock had its songwriters, Tavistock and EMI, okay? But what they needed a veneer. They needed a band that would front the music and front the social engineering initiative, which they called Beatlemania. You're talking before about the crescendo building when Adolf Hitler would speak. Well, they called it Beatlemania.
Mania, yeah, exactly.
Right?
What is a mania?
Right. So you've got the word mania in there.
Yeah, you bet.
And so I don't think they knew. Well, if in the book it tells us that they were given information with regard to directionally what was going to happen for them, fame and fortune, they would be very successful, and so on. But all of this is very compartmentalized. Obviously, you're not going to tell a bunch of 20-year-olds the big game plan. You're going to compartmentalize it. This is your role. This is what we need you to do. Just do it. I think as time went on and they got a little older, they started to piece things together. I don't know if we're going to talk about the death of biological Paul McCartney.
Yeah, I want to get to that, but I just want to work up to that.
Yeah. I was going to say, when that happened, I think they became more aware of something darker that was under the hood.
I can't imagine them, if that's true, I can't imagine them not becoming aware. But
right.
But leading up to that point, you're suggesting that their songs were given to them, that they were not the authors of their early music. I mean, all of those songs that they brought to the United States, I Want to Hold Your Hand, Love Me Do, all of that, they didn't write it, or did so. So then, let's say, run on that premise here. We can then take a look very differently at what those lyrics were, I suppose. I mean, were they? I mean, what is there an agenda there in terms of this Tavistock trying to introduce something, into the souls and into the minds of the young people?
Tavistock created the Beatles, created their music in order to bring about a social engineering initiative, a movement that was going to break down traditional values and institutionalize religion, in particular Christianity. So they were credited with writing the music, but they didn't write the music. Mm. And this happens all the time in the music industry. This is not something that is a one-off. If you speak to music industry, people who are in the industry, they will tell you that artists being credited for songs that they didn't write is not unusual. It's basically what it comes down to is a contractual agreement. So in any case, when the Beatles first got started in Hamburg in August of 1960, as I mentioned earlier, they didn't have any songwriting ability. How do we know this? There are several interviews with George Martin, who ended up being their producer. Many people refer to George Martin as the fifth Beatle.
Yes.
And in these interviews, he said that when he first received the tapes from Brian Epstein, he said, "I'm sorry, based upon what I'm hearing, I'm not going to sign him." So he wasn't impressed. And then he went on in other interviews to say that he didn't see that they had anything behind them, didn't see any songwriting ability. And in one interview, he said that he thought that their music was rubbish. So when Brian Epstein came to George Martin with the tapes and George Martin turned one down, that was the second time in 1962 that the Beatles were turned down. The first time was in January of 1962 with their Decca audition. They went to Decca.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And they banged out 15 songs, 12 of which were covers, 3 originals. They were 3 nondescript originals. The 3 songs never made it onto any of their official UK or Capitol releases while the band was together. One of the songs, I forgot which one it was, finally made it onto Anthology 1. So they didn't have a repertoire of music. They didn't have a backlog of music. In the documentary, The Complete Beatles, which goes back to 1980, and which was considered the Beatle documentary at the time, but this was before Anthology was released. It goes on to say that between 1956 and 1962, John Lennon and Paul McCartney, between the two of them, wrote 100 songs, but they were never recorded. But what happens, Charles, is as we make our way through the timeline, starting in 1960, going through 61, 62, 63, and so on, where are the 100 songs? Because George Martin said when he got them, he had to go out and find music for them to record.
Right.
Okay. So that's a very important piece of this. Also, there was a Mersey Beat article it was the August-September edition in 1962, and Mersey Beat was a like a music trade magazine back in the day.
Yeah.
When Ringo Starr replaced Pete Best, that was an article in the Mersey Beat. But in that article, it also went on to say that the Beatles were flying to London to go record songs that were written for them and given to them by their recording manager, their producer, George Martin.
I see.
There's a lot of stuff going on that is not really in the public domain. It is in the public domain, but it's not talked about. So what we get is the Cinderella story. That's always front and center, but you have these underlying threads of conversations and interviews that were had with George Martin. There was another one with their sound engineer, Norman Smith. Now, Norman was their sound engineer working with George Martin from Please Please Me through Rubber Soul.
Right.
With Revolver, it became Jeff Emmerich. So in 1971, there was an interview that was done with Norman Smith. And Norman said that he was not impressed with them at all. He said that they failed in the studio. So what happened? What happened was Tavistock wrote the songs, between Tavistock and EMI, they were connected at the hip. They had professional songwriters write the songs. Right. I have a clip of George Martin saying that the lead in the song Michelle is his composition. So George says, I wrote that piece of the song. It wasn't Paul McCartney. It wasn't George Harrison. It was him.
Right.
So also tied into this, if you read John Coleman's book, Dr. John Coleman and the Committee of 300, he links Theodore Adorno from the Frankfurt School into the Beatles' social engineering initiative, the psychological operation.
Yes.
Coleman claims that Adorno was writing the music. Now, I don't agree with Dr. Coleman on that because I believe it's very, very possible that Theodore Adorno did write Beatle music, but he didn't write all of it. And that's because of everything else that Adorno was involved in. I just couldn't get my head wrapped around how it is he was going to write books and he was going to do lectures and he was going to do this and that at the Frankfurt School. And then in the meantime, in his spare time, he was going to go write pop music for the Beatles. But right. Did he contribute to it? I think it's very likely. Did George Martin contribute? I think yes, I think that is the case. But I think the way they set it up was it was probably a handful of songwriters where George Martin and Theodore Adorno were overseeing the operation. So think of George Martin as the managing director of the initiative. And I believe it's possible that what they did was the songwriting was broken up so that there would be songs that would be John Lennon songs and there were songs that would be Paul McCartney songs. So in other words, they had a stylistic difference that was being presented, and then they could associate one style with John Lennon and another style with Paul McCartney. How do I know this? Well, why do I think this is possible? It's because I have a good source of mine, a very good source within the music industry. He analyzed a lot of the music going back to the early period from 1962 to 1966. And, he wrote me and got back to me and said, Mike, I'm hearing two different songwriting styles taking place here. And so we had a little bit of a discussion and I said, what's probably going on here is that they needed a writer to write Paul McCartney songs and they needed a writer or writers to do John Lennon sounding songs. So where I landed with this is that I don't believe they wrote much of anything between 1962 and 1966.
Okay. And yet, they must have known that they hadn't written anything. And yet right. Their names were on the copywritten
yes.
Sheets, which means that they got rich from it. They got yes. royalties. And that the people who did write it didn't get anything for it, which I don't know. I kind of have to think about that.
We don't know that, though. See, that's the thing. Okay. We don't know what the contractual setup was like.
Sure.
We don't know that. And we have to also remember that the people that would be involved in this would be very, very well compensated.
No, that's true.
We're talking about a deep state operation.
Yes.
That's what we're talking about. So all of the things that we might think, well, that doesn't seem right, and this guy's going to be out money. I look at that, I think to myself, well, just take that and throw it out the window because whoever was involved in this got well compensated, period. Whether it was through royalties or somebody just writing them a check.
That's fair.
Yeah.
Now, also, I always thought, again, this is just my own superficial observation of the Beatles. I always admired John Lennon the most because I always found him to be of the four of them somewhat of a truth teller. He would spill the beans every so often. I think that he did it when they were in the United States and you had these screaming women at the hotel, and he started to throw out Hitler salutes when he said, "We're more popular than Jesus." He wasn't saying that because it was good, but he was kind of spilling the beans a bit on what you're talking about. And that brings me to the story of Billy Shears, because I think that a song that was at least attributed to John Lennon, I think clearly tells the story of what happened to Paul McCartney, and that is A Day in the Life. He blew his mind out in the car. He didn't notice that the lights had changed, of how the people stood and stared. They turned away. They had read the book. I mean, people, in other words, he's talking about possibly what happened to Paul McCartney, which, according to that song, somebody was in a car accident and killed.
Right.
What say you?
Yeah, that's the prevailing conspiracy theory, that Paul McCartney was killed in a car crash. But nobody knows that for sure. And the more you look into the Beatles, they are immersed in the occult. And
Yes.
I've taken my audience through this for over 7 years, and I've shown a lot of evidence that they are immersed in the occult. I mean, if we just take a look at their second album with the Beatles, going back in time a bit, the front cover is the four faces of the Beatles with the shadow effect. It's the one-eyed symbolism on the album cover.
Yes.
So Lennon was a truth teller in the sense that he, more than any of the other Beatles over time, even in interviews, was dropping clues. In fact, a better song that I would say that he did, which I consider to be the ultimate Paul is Dead song, is How Do You Sleep off his Imagine album.
Mm-hmm.
And when you read the book, here's the book here, The Memoirs of Billy Shears.
Yes.
When you read this book, what happens is when you listen to How Do You Sleep, a lot of pieces of the puzzle fall in place. You get an inner understanding of what it is that John Lennon was really referring to. Also, in interviews going back into the 1970s, the early 70s at Rolling Stone magazine, he called the Beatles a myth. He called Paul McCartney a myth.
The dream is over, right?
Yes, well, in the song God, I don't believe in Beatles. The dream is over. Mm-hmm. He referred to Bob Dylan as a myth. Lennon said that the Beatles were over the moment that they were signed and put into suits, that he much preferred the period in which they were doing the bar and club scene and playing, straightforward rock and roll music. So it was stuff like that, because you would think to yourself, well, really, that was better than being a Beatle, But he was dropping clues. In my mind, what he was saying is, hey, there's a lot going on here that you, the fans, the audience, don't know about. And he wasn't really in a position to really openly talk about it, but he could drop clues here and there, and he did.
Right. And you say that the Beatles' imagery, their songs, their graphics, their persona is drenched in occultic symbolism. And I think that's something that it seems pretty obvious. I mean, the most blatant example, of course, is the cover of the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, where you literally have a drawing of Aleister Crowley. And there's all kinds of stuff going on with that. The other thing about the Beatles and all of that stuff is that it seems obvious that they must have been the trendsetter in terms of moving society forward, not only because they were visibly so incredibly successful and famous and apparently, at least allegedly rich, that everyone, got caught up in emulating that. It's almost like gods. And they were being worshipped as idols, as false gods. That, of course, that spawned a bunch of other bands, both in Great Britain, like the Rolling Stones. I just read Mick Jagger is worth $500 million. I mean, these guys got incredible rewards for basically strumming the guitar and singing. I mean, what was it about them that they were catapulted? They obviously saw something about what the Beatles were doing. They probably at some level understood that this was what made you successful, and they imitated it. And I think that was true across the board, and that, not to digress just briefly, but in the United States, I think there was a very similar phenomenon in that I don't think there's any question that the Grateful Dead were handled by the CIA.
Right.
And that you have these these rock stars whose parents were deep state figures, like Jim Morrison. His father actually concocted the Gulf of Tonkin
Right.
attack, and David Crosby from Crosby, Stills and Nash. We could mention others. The point is that there was a reason why these people, and they got it whether consciously or not, were getting that kind of adulation and the girls and the money and the glory. I mean, it was incredible looking at it. And I think that they were doing it because they saw how the Beatles got that. So the Beatles, I mean, it seems to me to make sense, thus, that the Beatles were being managed by what President Trump calls the deep state. There's a bunch of euphemisms for it, but the secret edifice that runs the show. It just seems obvious to me. So what do you think happened to Paul McCartney?
I believe Paul McCartney passed away back in 1966. The book tells us it was on September 11th of 1966. September 11th is a very
important date
very important date. Other researchers think it was possibly back in August. Some think it could have been November. But in either case, whether it's August, September, or November, 1966 was the year. Now, I believe it's possible that Paul McCartney's death was a ritual sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
And these ritual sacrifices, they take place. A lot of people have a hard time getting their arms around this. In the book, it's referred to as death for success. So it also says in the book that John Lennon and Paul McCartney entered into a Faustian bargain in October of 1963. And what was that bargain about? They released their Please Please Me album, their debut UK album, on March 22nd, 1963. So there's the 322, Skull and Bones number. 7 months later, in October, allegedly, this Faustian bargain, this pact takes place. And of course, by going through the pact, they're told great things are going to happen. Do you like your success right now? Oh, we love it. You like the money? Oh, we love it. You like the fame? Yeah, it's great. Okay, there's a lot more of that if you do X, Y, and Z.
Mm-hmm.
So the book tells us this pact was taking place. And by the way, Memoirs is not the only book to talk about the possibility of a Faustian bargain taking place. There's another book that is written by an author by the name of Joseph Niezgoda called The Lennon Prophecy. He speculates that John Lennon entered into a Faustian bargain back in December of 1960. So it's not just the Memoirs of Billy Shears that's talking about the possibility of a deal with the devil. So once they have that Faustian bargain, they catapult it. And then their With the Beatles album was released on November 22nd in 1963. It's the same day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated.
Indeed.
So 11/22, right? So we have the 33, the Masonic.
And there's a lot of stuff around that. I mean, that's
Yes.
a whole, that's a big rabbit hole. I mean, a lot of, as you say, a lot of Masonic imagery.
Yeah.
You could go to huge volumes on that subject.
And what we have to remember, Charles,
Yeah.
I explained to my audience that the music and entertainment industry is completely controlled. It's one of the major levers, one of the big tools in the toolbox of the controllers. It is a way that they can easily manipulate consciousness.
By the way, I don't think that what you're saying here is in any way, controversial, in that there really are, and there were, I don't know if it's the same now, but there was maybe 4 or 5 record companies that decided everything.
Yeah.
They decided who was signed and who wasn't. They conducted a large part of what went down. I mean, they groomed people in a certain way, right down to what they looked like and how they acted, and they signed agreements because they were investing in them. Like, I suppose it's like the old Hollywood system too. I mean,
Yeah.
that they would become part of a stable, is what they actually called it, where people would basically sell a level of their independence as a person in exchange for fame and money and all of the goodies that you get with that. And so, I mean, of course, the music business ran that way. They decided who got to be on the radio. They decided who got to sell records. They decided what the album cover looked like. That was very important back then.
Right.
And it all seemed to have a certain homogenized look to it, and it all basically, as we are saying, sent out the same message that was spearheaded by the Beatles.
Right. That's because there's an agenda.
Yes.
And so I explained this in another show that I was on last night. They asked me a similar question. are you saying that all of these bands are fabricated? I said, no. You have to understand is that when you get into the system, when you get into the music business or the entertainment industry, it's a system. You're going to have to do things the way they want you to do things. So like you were saying, it's the cover art on the album. It's how these bands are packaged and presented. So it's
Indeed.
like if you worked for a company and your boss says to you, hey, we want you to go off and do this analysis and build this presentation because we want to go take it to the shareholders. Many times what happens in the corporate world is they'll take a look at that. Even though what you did is what's going on, they have a different story to tell. The person doing the work is creating something naturally and taking a look at something objectively, but that natural objective effort gets reshaped because of a message or an agenda that the upper levels of the company want to communicate. It's the same thing when we're talking about a record company, because the argument is that, there are people who are naturally talented. There are people that play on their recordings. There are people that write music. Yes. But along the way, what happens is there is an agenda that the record labels have because they're tied into the machine.
It's no different than when you go to work for a corporation, you might sign a confidentiality clause where you agree not to reveal inner workings of the company.
Right.
You agree not to work for the competitor. I think in the case of the music business, when you're dealing with that kind of visibility and success, it must be at least implied that if you step out of line, we're going to take you out. And we could look at a number of people who died, whether it was because of as part of a ritual sacrifice, which I don't doubt, or just, I don't know, like I think of Brian Jones, right? What happened to him?
Brian Jones, Keith Moon, John Bonham.
Yeah, all of those guys. So here we have Paul McCartney, according to what we're talking about, passing away in 1966. Obviously, the other three guys knew this, and they have sat on that. The new guy comes in. Who is he, and how did they transform him into the new Paul McCartney?
Okay, so I call him Billy Shears, and if we have time, I can take you through an interview I did with another Beatles researcher who did an amazing job, and I think she may have identified who his true family is,
Yes.
his bloodlines. Okay, but we could talk about that in a bit. So some people believe that Billy, who is playing the part of Paul McCartney and has been since 1966, he has the primary contract. He's the primary replacement. Okay, so there have been others who have paged in and out, lookalikes and doubles and so on. There have been lookalikes and doubles with the Beatles since day one. I was told by one source that from day one, there were 3 doubles for every Beatle. So there's Paul McCartney, and he had 3 doubles and lookalikes. There was John and 3 doubles and lookalikes. So there was 4 of them. And these doubles and lookalikes could have been used as decoys and stuff like that. Billy just did not show up. In other words, there wasn't a contest to go identify a lookalike and then bring him in and then shape this person and mold him and do all this work to create somebody that looked like Paul McCartney. That's not what happened. He was handled and brought along through the system. Now, I don't know whether the ultimate plan was he was going to wind up in the Beatles as the primary focal point or handler of the band. In other words, he was going to really lead the psychological operation, the social engineering initiative when he got there. Think of it as the handler was internalized within the band. But I believe he goes back as far as 1962. So I think he was in the pipeline for quite a while. I think that as a studio musician, it's likely that he was playing on their records. Also, going back a number of years ago, he made a statement that he wrote the song In My Life. And this was in the newspapers. And of course, this shocked a lot of people because In My Life is a John Lennon song.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
And but he came out and said, no, I wrote that song. And so the media went into damage control, and they had 2 universities. I forgot who they were. They ran these, quote, computer models to prove that, no, it was John Lennon. Paul McCartney misremembered writing the song, which is comical because In My Life is considered to be one of the greatest rock songs of all time. So when you take a look at rock polls and they vote for the greatest songs of all time, it winds up in the upper tier of the voting. You just don't forget writing a song, any song that you wrote, but in particular,
not a masterpiece like that.
Not a masterpiece like that. So what Billy was telling us is that he was around prior to 1966. And what he was telling us, my opinion, is that he was writing music on behalf of the Beatles. So
that might indicate that Billy Shears, whatever his name is, he was a little closer to Tavistock than the other
yes,
guys. He
and
was maybe one of the original songwriters.
yes, it's very possible that he was a ghostwriter during the 62 through 66 period. Now, I should say this also. From 1967 to 1970, the other songwriting Beatles, mostly John Lennon and then a bit of George Harrison, they contributed more to the songwriting between 67 and 70 and played on more of the recorded tracks during that period. But between 67 and 70, the Beatles were still utilizing, when I talk about the Beatles, I'm talking about the Beatles as an entity, the Beatles
Right.
as the, right, were still utilizing ghostwriters and using session players on their recorded tracks.
Okay.
From 62 to 66, I don't believe that they wrote anything. And I don't believe that they played on the recorded tracks as well. There's an interview, I don't know if you know who Bernard Purdie is. Bernard is a famous drummer, session drummer, okay?
Right.
And Bernard played with Aretha Franklin for about 25 years. And, he's been on many, many recordings, rock recordings. Yeah. Back in I think it was 78, he came out and said that he played on 21 Beatle tracks. He drummed on 21 Beatle tracks.
Right.
And Bernard has been saying this now for 45 years. And he came out with a book in 2014. It's titled Let the Drums Speak. And he has a chapter dedicated to what he refers to as the Ringo Starr controversy. And he stands his ground. So for 45 years, Bernard hasn't budged. Now, back in the early 2000s, he did an interview. And they asked him specifically about this controversy. And at first, he's like, I don't want to talk about this, because in the book, Bernard tells us that he had received death threats for coming out with this information. And obviously, it became very, very uncomfortable for him. But in this interview, it was in 2004, if I recall, he goes on to say that, look, 98% of the bands that you believe are playing on the records are not playing on the records.
Right.
They're studio players. And then he goes on to say at the toward the tail end of this discussion about the Beatles, that there were 4 drummers on Beatles music. And he's talking about the early period between 62 and 66. And he said Ringo was not one of them. So Bernard was obviously one. He drummed on 21. Andy White was another, because the official narrative tells us that Andy was on P.S. I Love You and Love Me Do. But I think Andy White drummed on a lot more songs than the 2 that the official narrative tells us about. And I received an email from a person that I had been corresponding with for a bit, and I knew that they knew a lot more than what they were saying. Her relative was Ronnie Verrill. Ronnie Verrill was a great jazz and studio musician out of the UK. And Ronnie died, must be about a decade ago now. She said he was also one of the drummers on the Beatles tracks.
Okay.
Then I have not an interview, but it was a show that Glenn Campbell did. Now, Glenn Campbell was a fantastic, phenomenal guitar player.
Yeah, absolutely.
And he was with the Wrecking Crew.
Yes, he was. Incredible.
The Wrecking Crew.
The Beach Boys, all of that.
All of that.
Incredible
and the Wrecking Crew model was the model. And in fact, in the UK, they had their own version of the Wrecking Crew. Studio musicians like Vic Flick and Big Jim Sullivan, Jimmy Page.
Jimmy Page
Jimmy Page was a studio player. So Glenn Campbell, he's guest hosting the Smothers Brothers show in July of 1968, and he's introducing the band Cream. So Cream would be Eric Clapton, Jack Bruce, and Ginger Baker.
Right.
And as he's introducing them, he says these guys are known as top-notch studio session players in the UK, and they have played on records for the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and, he rattles off a couple of other bands.
Right.
What's very important about that is in July of 1968, when Glenn Campbell said this was 2 months before Eric Clapton ever picked up a guitar to go play the lead on While My Guitar Gently Weeps.
Sure.
What was Glenn telling us? Glenn was telling us that Ginger Baker, Jack Bruce, and Eric Clapton, or a combination of those 3, were on the Beatles recorded tracks. So it's possible when Bernard Purdie said there were 4 drummers, which would be Andy White himself, and I know Ronnie Verrill based upon my source, the 4th could have been Ginger Baker.
Right. That wouldn't surprise me. He was brilliant.
Right. I'm glad that doesn't surprise you because it makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah.
So in any case, so, Billy comes from elite bloodlines. And if the researcher that I interviewed, Stacy, is correct, and I believe her case to be extremely compelling, that interview is up on my channels. His father was Douglas Hamilton. So he comes from the Douglas Hamilton Scottish bloodline. So it's Lord
Right.
Douglas Hamilton. And his mother, Elizabeth Percy, comes from the Percy bloodline. A lot of people
They go all the way back to William the Conqueror. I mean, we're talking about old English.
Hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And the case that she puts forth, like I said, is very compelling. So what does that tell us? That tells us that Billy is big time serious blue blood. And so what do these bloodlines do? Well, they move their own blood, their own family through the pipeline to be in positions of influence and power.
Sure.
So in the book, it tells us that Billy actually was subjected to mind control and ritual abuse as a child. And he says in the book that his earliest recollection was age 3, which is interesting because if you watch documentaries on ritual abuse, the age 3 seems to be a starting point. He also mentions that he was tutored and mentored by Aleister Crowley between 1937 when he was born and 47 when Crowley passed away. Mm-hmm. So his family would have been connected into Crowley. Crowley was part of the elite circle. Sure. He was involved in intelligence, British intelligence. If Stacy's right about Billy's father, Douglas Hamilton, he was with the RAF. So Billy wasn't somebody that they pulled off the street. They didn't grab him by the scruff of the neck and just bring him in. This was somebody that was tapped to be in a position of influence, and it happened to be the Beatles at that point in time.
And I would think that they probably did some sort of plastic surgery to make him look a lot like McCartney. I mean, you don't just, you can't just, and this is an incredible, public figure. You can't just expect, people not to kind of get wind of it unless he really was literally molded to look like McCartney.
He had a lot of plastic surgery, cosmetics. He had fillers. He doesn't look anything like Paul McCartney. I know what he looks like. Prior to the transition to the Paul McCartney character, he's Scottish. He's got reddish blonde hair.
Right, different guy. But and I think that from what I can tell, going way back, the Beatles left a lot of goose eggs in terms of McCartney being dead. I mean, I Buried Paul. I mean, played it backwards. Lots of stuff like that. The Abbey Road, he's walking across the street with bare feet, he looks like a corpse. Right. Whereas the other guys, Lennon is dressed as a minister, and George Harrison is a grave digger, and Ringo is an undertaker.
Right.
And these sorts of things were maybe a way for them to either try to, let the beans out, or maybe just let off some steam. I don't know. I mean. But it does seem like there were all these fascinating and rather tantalizing hints about what was going on.
Yeah, it could also be that what they were doing, because at this point, when we're talking about Abbey Road, see, when Billy took over the band, he took over the band.
Right, and that's even Lennon has said that.
Yeah, he took over the
band. He was almost shunted aside.
Yeah, so a lot of the backmasking and these clues and whatnot, Billy is an occultist. So we can also take a look at this, and we can say that the clues, the backmasking, the symbolism was a continuation of ritual. I'll just put that out there.
Yeah. And some of his songs seem very ritualistic. Fool on the Hill has a lot of, occultic imagery, Helter Skelter. I mean, that obviously. What about after they broke up? I mean, they always seem to be very managed and handled by a whole team of experts around them, circulating around them, starting with Brian Epstein, but continuing on. And they had all these people really doing everything for them. I mean, they probably had valets figuring out what they were going to wear. They just seemed to be very totally surrounded by people to make sure that they walked and talked in a certain way. What about after the Beatles broke up? I mean, did that continue? And what about McCartney now? I mean, why doesn't he say something? You'd think that he must be in his 80s now. It's like it's getting up there. He's still doing gigs. I mean, he did the Boston Fenway Park, and he did a tremendous concert here. What is there any indication that he might be ready to spill the beans? I know he did a pretty famous interview with Howard Stern where he didn't give any hint at all about this.
No, he's not going to say anything.
Okay.
He's not going to say anything. The Beatles are fundamental to this whole movement. As I mentioned earlier, Charles, the Eon of Horus, and I refer to them as the Pied Pipers. Pied means multicolored, right? So when you take a look at the Sgt. Pepper album, they're in multicolored outfits.
Indeed.
So Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band is representative of the Pied Pipers. Now we're going to move society forward, move them in a different direction, and take them down a certain path. So he's not going to say anything because the Beatles are still very, very important to what's going on, even though they haven't been together in 50 years.
Right.
But what we see is the Beatles' influence is everywhere. When we listen to interviews from other bands and artists, almost always there's a mention of the Beatles. There's a mention of Paul McCartney. They're paying homage to the Beatles because the Beatles were foundational to all of the other bands, all of the other genres that followed after them.
Right. I suppose if they pulled the plug on the Beatles, the whole rotten mess would fall into a heap of dust. I mean, in a way, maybe that's what they're afraid of. But, this whole edifice is kept up with that kind of scaffolding. And I guess that, whatever McCartney or Billy Shears, whatever his name is, he'll just take it to the grave. Who killed John Lennon?
Well, it wasn't Mark David Chapman, I don't think.
No, I mean, it looked like a professional, well-calculated military-style execution.
Well, people have looked into this. They claim that Jose Perdomo was the doorman at the Dakota that night. Jose was with Operation 40, which was the CIA assassination unit.
Right.
There's a gentleman out of the UK now. I think his name is David Whalen, and he's essentially reopened the John Lennon assassination investigation. He's pointing to Chapman wasn't the guy. It was somebody else. It's interesting, though. I did listen to an interview with him, and he didn't mention Jose Perdomo's name, which I thought was curious. But you're absolutely right, Charles. John Lennon was shot with precision. That was done by a professional assassin.
Why?
Well, that's an interesting question. So,
I mean, I know that this is simply a off-the-wall thought, but his entire catalog, including his new album, Double Fantasy, made huge money after he was killed. I don't think he was selling that much before that. He kind of disappeared for a number of years.
He went on hiatus for 5 years. He was out of the picture from 75 through 80.
Then all of a sudden he comes out with this new album, which was not the greatest. I mean, it's okay, but it wasn't, I don't think, the peak of his creativity. I don't know who might have been behind that, but the point is that suddenly after he was killed, I mean, I think that kind of thing happens in the music business. There's so much money involved and there's so much power involved. And I'm not going to point any fingers like David Geffen or anything like that, but people made huge amounts of money, and the thing rocketed after he was killed. It became the biggest album for years, I think.
Yeah, it was interesting. I agree with you. It was not one of his greatest efforts. I mean, when we think about it, I think he had 6 of his songs, and there were 6 of Yoko's songs.
Yeah.
I remember taking the record, because I had the vinyl back in the day, and I transferred it to cassette, and I took all of Yoko's music off. So I had 6 brand new John Lennon tracks. Now, why he was assassinated? There's some theories out there. One is that John was going to, or he was talking about writing a tell-all book, and he was going to spill the beans about what the Beatles were really all about. That was one theory.
Sure.
The second theory is that John entered into that Faustian bargain that I talked about earlier. And in the book I was just talking to you about, the Lennon Prophecy, this book here by Joseph Niezgoda, it states that many of these pacts are 20 years in duration. So they've got 20 years of runway. So in the book, he speculates that in December of 1960 is when Lennon entered into that pact, and that 20 years later would take him to December of 1980.
Indeed. That was when he was killed.
Okay, so that's I don't know. I mean, you can't say anything for sure. That's just more intriguing than anything else. Chapman himself was, in my view, a patsy, and he had gotten deeply into a lot of satanic stuff as well.
Right.
So, but I don't think he pulled the trigger. I think that the Jose Perdomo or some other assassin did the dirty deed.
Yeah, I mean, it does look like a professional sort
Professional
of a
hit.
hit, and we can't know why. I mean, Lennon was a thorn in the side, certainly, of the Nixon
Oh
administration.
yeah, yeah.
Not that that was a part of it. I don't know if they, at that point, they cared, but I even think Nixon was out of office at that point. But, he had some enemies. And George Harrison, uh, you know, I saw a video of him playing guitar and singing While My Guitar Gently Weeps. The Beatles have gotten very cheap about what they allow on the internet. They've taken most of it down.
Yeah.
But again, everything to them is you have to buy it.
It's very
But
protected. Yeah.
before that, there he is just playing the song, singing, playing guitar, wearing a t-shirt and jeans, no music around him, nobody around him, no special effects. And it was brilliant.
Yeah.
Absolutely brilliant. I mean, I think that these guys did have talent. I don't know if he wrote that, but I mean, especially maybe later on, I think that they must have been involved in it.
Yeah. Like I said, between 67 and 70, they were contributing more to the content.
Right.
What people have to understand is in the early period, 62 to 66 in particular, that was very, very important as part of the social engineering initiative. That whole Beatlemania period, that had to go perfectly in order to really launch this whole thing. And so Tavistock, EMI, they weren't going to leave anything to chance. So they were going to make sure that, the right songs were going to go out there, the right people were going to play on the records. The Beatles can play their instruments.
Right.
People say, are you saying the Beatles didn't play their instruments? I said, no, I never said that. I said, yes, they were performers. They were taught the songs that they took out on the road. So when they did live gigs and they did their concerts, those were songs that they were taught to play. They learned to play them, they sang them, and they went to the next city.
To the next gig, yeah.
The next gig, right? That's what they did. But once they got to 1967, all that touring and all that stuff was over.
So at that point, I mean, everything was very finely produced and developed, I think, in terms of their very canned records. In a way, it almost went out of style what they were doing. I mean, some of their, I think they had some genuine stuff on the White Album and on even on the Rooftop gig. I mean, they seemed to be genuine there. But still, it was all so like canned and so rehearsed and so careful that and so professional. I mean, I can't believe that McCartney did the solo guitar part on Maybe I'm Amazed. I mean, it's such a beautiful guitar piece. I don't think he played that.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure they had the very best people come in, and they were surrounded by people who did everything for them. I mean, I think that Harrison even admitted this. He goes, all things must pass. He goes, there's a lot of people on that record. That's a big.
Well, he was tied into Phil Spector with All Things Must Pass. And, Phil Spector was a main cog with the Wrecking Crew. And
right.
if you take a look at the Beatles' solo careers, it's a who's who of studio musicians that were on all of their records.
Sure.
John Lennon, Harrison, Ringo Starr in particular. I mean,
sure.
I mean, he even had Jim Keltner on his records drumming. I thought to myself, aren't you a drummer, Ringo? Why is Jim Keltner drumming on your records, But, and Billy, the same thing, Billy surrounded himself with great studio players.
Absolutely.
That's just how the business works, Charles. You're going to come in and make a record. You want to put the best tracks you possibly can. Well, what are you going to do? You're going to seek out the best players you can who are available to you. And that's how you're going to do the recording.
Sure. Okay. So, Mike Williams, this is really an interesting conversation. We've opened up so many areas of thought here. I want to kind of wrap it up and just, again, reiterate that the theory here is that at least the Tavistock Institute had something to do with this, and that it's perfectly reasonable to assume that they did because it was a massive psychological program. And that's what they did. That was their business.
Right. That
they're interconnected with secretive, like organizations in all of the major countries around the world. And that the Beatles, in fact, had an impact on society. They changed the way we see ourselves. They change the way we think. In some ways, maybe to the better, but there's a very dark side. And I think that we have to understand what that is in order to understand the way the world works.
I agree.
So, Mike Williams, let my listeners and viewers know where they can watch your excellent program and listen to your excellent music.
Just go to my hub website, folks. It's Sage of Quay, SAGEOFQUAY.com. And all of my links are there to my platforms, my music. It's one-stop shop. So if you go there, take a listen.
Excellent. Mike Williams, listen, let's stay in touch. I mean, if there's anything that comes up, contact me. I'd love to have you on again.
Thank you, Charles.
You're welcome. And I really appreciate you joining me.
It was a pleasure.
All right. Thanks a lot.